Welcome to the weekly Defence Podcast, the show about defence procurement and military technology. We are brought to you in partnership with our sponsor, Namo. I'm your host, Richard Thomas, and on the show this week, we are coming to you from the floor of ITSEC here in Orlando, the world's biggest military simulation and training show. And with the V-22 tilt rotor recently passing the 500,000 flight hour milestone, we speak to author Richard Whittle about how the Osprey has changed warfare. But first, our weekly news roundup, and I'm joined by Tony Skinner, VP Content. Hi, Tony.
Hi, Richard.
And Trevor Nash, Editor, Military Training and Simulation News. Trevor, hey, mate.
Hi, Richard. How's it going?
Very well, thank you. Delighted to be here. So, I thought I'd get started with some themes, trends, and kind of what's happening on the show floor in the wider training market itself. I'm going to kick it off and say I think mobility is the driving force behind companies showcasing solutions here and also what they're looking to develop in future years. You need to be able to get systems in the hands of the customers, and those systems have to be able to be transported, moved wherever those customers want to use them.
Yeah, and I guess when you talk about mobility, you're talking about deployability. Every other company talked about how their systems will be available at the point of need. And I think point of need is it's almost a US Army requirement now. I think it's built into sort of some programs. The vendors here have obviously picked up on that, and that's the term that they're using. Obviously, as things get smaller, they can be packaged up into. I mean, Pelican Cases has had loads of references as well. It's been a good marketing exercise for them. You can pack it up in a Pelican case, get it out to the guys in the field. I guess it kind of relates as well to the services looking at, okay, if we were to go to war tomorrow, how would we prepare for that? Are we prepared for that kind of near-peer competitor conflict? And in that case, it's likely to be something that they're not, they haven't been trained for heavily over the last decades. So they're going to require those training solutions to do it as they deploy. So the modularity, the flexibility, we're hearing all these buzz terms, but yeah, training at the point of need.
Trevor, what about you?
I think you're absolutely right, Tony. There is a requirement for deployable simulation, and it does need to be at the point of need. And a couple of examples of that, the Queen Elizabeth carrier in the UK has F-35 simulators on board to allow training. And in the UK also, the Future Typhoon Training Systems programme calls for more simulators down at the frontline level in the squadrons as opposed to the operational conversion units. Last year there were a handful of companies showing such systems, but this show there are a heck of a lot more. But there again, that does raise a question as to, are these things a panacea, and will they or will they not be able to replace the larger full flight simulators and the weapon systems trainers?
I mean, my contention on this is, I've spoken to a few companies obviously keen to sort of push their VR solutions into the wider market and all the customers with it. But they sort of are in agreement with the idea that the concept of full mission simulators might be either dying a death or on its way out at some point, because they're just not as, I hate to say it, maybe not as sophisticated or as mobile as the customer will need them to be in future.
We just spoke to Ryan Aerospace, which I think is a great example of that. Chris Ryan, the founder, wanted to train, wanted to learn how to fly a helicopter. He was converting from a fixed wing. Asked his, this is sort of 10 years ago, asked his instructors, well, how can I get cheap helicopter simulated training? And there was nothing on the market. So he developed a simulator, on a platform, a game controller that he's kind of hot-wired, developed the software himself, and has now got a solution that he's selling into Fort Rucker. So you think of the number of companies here that could have developed a solution to sell to the US Army into Fort Rucker, and this guy on the Gold Coast in Australia is kind of, stole the march because, he's just slapped together with VR headset and it's done in a way that's effective.
I'd like to add a caveat. The problem with these low-cost trainers that we're seeing now is the fidelity level. And a lot of them are relying on head-mounted displays where the fidelity is not as good as it could be. Okay, some are coming out from companies like Vario, for instance, that have got higher resolution. There's also a problem with field of view and also the human-machine interface with the actual simulator. So although I agree there is a trend towards a lower-cost device, I still think there's a place for the higher fidelity full mission simulator to be used at places like the operational conversion unit, because there, when you're practicing emergencies, you need to be totally aware of your environment that you're flying in, and these lower devices can't cut the mustard there. However, that said, they are incredibly good at squadron level for maintaining skill sets and also, dare I say it, network together to practice tactics. So there is a place. I don't think they will totally replace the full mission trainer.
Do you think there may be, as you say, talking about places for the kind of VR training systems, do you think that's best suited to the lower and mid-level training requirements, whether it's early recruits looking to get base-level skills up to date, or even the mid-level skills that you need to get, just keeping up to date with the requirements, the basic skills that you learnt 2 or 3 years back? We're just doing a refresh course, basically. Good for students and refresh courses, you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, I think you're right, Richard. The one area where we've got to be very careful about is what's referred to as negative training, that we're not teaching false lessons on these lower cost devices. And it's very difficult to draw the line where you step over it into the false lesson environment. But I'm convinced that, there was a study done many years ago in the commercial training airline industry where students were put through a very low cost PC-based trainer. Half the students went through that scheme. The other trainers didn't. Other students didn't. And then when they got onto the airline ATPL course, lo and behold, the people that had done the low-cost training were way superior and soloed earlier. So there is basis to this argument. There's an intellectual study that's been done. But again, as I say, it's where you draw that line, how much you do on what device.
I've got a question for Trevor, actually. How many realities are there in this world? We've got virtual reality, augmented reality. There's a number of systems now that are mixed reality. And I think I've heard of the term extended reality or cross reality, right? How much of that is an indication that technology is advancing, and how much of it is just buzzwords that companies are throwing around?
That is a brilliant question, Tony. Virtual reality, everybody talks about virtual reality today as it's some new environment that one can train in. But if you think of the first simulators that didn't have computers driving them, they had model boards where a camera flew over. That is virtual reality, because you're not seeing the real world, you're seeing a virtual world. And as to your augmented reality, mixed reality, I think the term extended reality now is replacing both of those terms. So, in this industry and many others, people bandy around terms and definitions without truly knowing what they are.
Let's talk technologies then. So being a bit of a gamer myself, I was delighted to see Epic Games showcasing their Unreal Engine. Obviously not the first time that a entertainment or commercial software engine has shown its kit off here at ITSEC. Trevor, you said there's been Havoc, I think, previously. Yeah. Nevertheless, obviously Epic Games with its Unreal Engine, it's a significant piece of software. We know that Raytheon's using it for its V-22 digital training system. Just what kind of technology have you seen? What's caught your eye?
I guess going back to the extended reality sort of idea, we did get a good demonstration from Kratos. I've got 3 or 4 sort of different configurations here. The idea being that in their light rooms, they cover the wall in sort of this either green or blue sort of tape. You can see the simulation, but then you can also see your own arms. In one, they've got a rear gunner of a CH-47, so you can obviously see the weapon. It allows you to do, if the weapon was to jam, for example, you can actually carry out the steps to unjam that weapon. But then when you look around, they've got a virtual wall. You turn around, you'll see the rest of the simulated environment rather than seeing, the rest of the stand per se. So, that tactile nature of being able to touch what's in the configuration, that was really impressive. Also, for mine, I really enjoyed the Cruden fast boat simulator. That's a company that their background was in Formula One simulators. Their line is that the software they use to simulate the tyre on the road is very similar to what they've used to simulate the hull on the water. And, where a lot of companies are coming at this from a sort of bridge simulator, big ships, theirs is coming from sort of that fast boat, fast craft, and the simulator, the way it's kind of perched up on its actuators there, it's pretty impressive, and it's always got a good crowd. So,
there have been a couple of things that have really got my attention. One of them is MetaVR, which has brought a portable JTAC trainer, and they've integrated that with an F-18. So the F-18 simulator is very much like we were talking about earlier on, about being very low cost. But the difference between that and many other simulators here, low-cost simulators, is they're not using gaming technology. They're using satellite and UAV-derived terrain, so that's highly realistic. Triality was another company that made me smile. They've got a new glass mirror collimated display, providing a 210 by 45 degree image, but they're only using one projector for that. And there are, of course, major cost savings. There are also long-term ownership improvements to that system. So it'll be very interesting to see how that develops. On the display side, Barco, although they've made direct view displays for a long time, mainly for the command and control sector, they were selected by Elbit to go onto the UK's mobile JTAC trainer with a very high fidelity, highly realistic flat screen display. And then, we keep coming back to this VR, which I say, of course, is not new, but it's how you integrate that VR into the live training environment. And one of the things that Saab were showing is how they've inserted VR into their live domain. And they were showing a Ford Observer trainer, and they were also showing a mortar crew trainer. And of course, those two can be combined. So you've got the FOO in the virtual environment, which is made up of the actual real environment, and he can bring down fire on targets to his front. And the same applied to a Spike trainer that they've got, again using the digitized real terrain that they're training on to engage targets out to 4 kilometers. So, that trend of inserting more virtual into the live continues.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to being back here in 12 months' time to see if there's any changes to the market and the kind of systems that are being showcased. But for this, thank you very much. For more information on all of these stories, links, of course, will be provided in the show notes, or you can see the Shephard Media website. Coming up on the podcast, we speak to Richard Whittle about the V-22. But first, I chat to Boo's Alan Hamilton about the training market.
As part of Shephard Media's business information offerings, we now offer a series of market forecasts which enable you to understand both the broader competitive landscape and the finer detail of various sectors of the defence industry. Each market forecast identifies the demand for platforms and equipment, as well as analysing programmes in each defence sector, broken down by region from North America to Asia Pacific. To date, we have produced market forecasts on the armoured vehicles market, naval vessels market, and we have just released our military unmanned systems market forecast. Soon, we will release our 10-year forecast on the military aircraft market, and later in the year, we will look at the artillery and air defence market. To find out more about our market forecast, please email subs@shepherdmedia.com or visit the Shephard Media website.
As the military training market moves ever closer towards the digital realm, industry continues to position itself to meet current and future requirements. Delighted to be joined by two directors at Boo's, Alan Hamilton, Eric Billies, thank you very much. Thank you. And Chris Hempel, thank you very much for joining us both.
Yeah, good morning.
So, gents, can I kick off? Why is the immersive training environment gaining in popularity? Chris, over to you first.
Yeah, thanks. So really what we see for a lot of our training is the ability to simulate environments that were either too costly, dangerous, and just really challenging for large groups of people to work together. You have to schedule a meeting, you have to schedule a training exercise and bring everyone to it. Very costly, time consuming. The ability now with VR and AR is we can now take that training and push it down to the individual. We can scale it up to large groups. We can push it down the individual. And simulate through VR is really good at bringing an emotional aspect to it. I can transport you very well, and I can dial up and double down the emotional parts of that experience to really simulate that experience much more than I can do with a PowerPoint, which we see in a lot of organizations, or even a video training or a 2D screen. I bring and transform you and bring you into that environment. I can really train your whole body. So physically, your body remembers the muscle movements of that experience.
And Eric, you both work in the immersive studios side of Booz Allen Hamilton. From your perspective, why is the immersive training environment increasing in popularity among users?
Yeah, so thanks, Richard. So part of it, and I'll key off of a little bit what Chris just said, part of it is also the mobility aspect. So when you're talking about forces in the field, so part of our client set is Navy and Marine Corps clients is what we focus on in the defense market and other services as well. But part of it is just taking that training right down to what we call in the Navy the deck plate level. So they're not constrained by infrastructure. They're not going to have to go to dome trainers. You're taking it right now to them. And I think that's super important when you're trying to get as many repetitions as possible into that. And so that's where the services are really starting to adapt that, because they see that as a real game changer for them. Additionally, you're now bringing in all of the analytics, all of the cyber aspects to it. So that's part of what Booz Allen is actually bringing to the fore. Is we're bringing all of those pieces together, and that's where the warfighters really see that as a game changer for them. So mobility, portability, and cost is really a big deal for them.
Yeah, just to add on to that, too, I agree 100% with Eric on that, is really engagement, too. So I mentioned earlier before PowerPoint. There's so much PowerPoint we see as far as training happening. And now you're dealing with, kids, 18-year-old young men coming out, 18, 19, and women. And you have a classroom and you're demonstrating with PowerPoint. So it's like, okay, this is not a really engaging method. You lose them pretty quickly. So how can we take experiences that they're familiar with and use that as a method for training? So instead of, let's say, showing on a PowerPoint in a classroom how to conduct some sort of mission, and we've done this with clients, is let's change that where now I can, at least as an instructor, walk through that experience and show you and get down on the ground and show you the perspective and say, okay, this is what you don't want to see. This is what you want to do. This is how you want to line up. And how do you train in that real environment in something that's tactically, visually resembles the actual space that you're going to do those work.
Yeah, again, Chris mentioned this in his earlier question, talked about the emotional aspects of this. So when you're looking at any sort of a 2D or even sometimes just purely simulated in a classroom type environment, you lack your blood starts to race, right? And I'm going to give an example of something where you have like a VR rifle or something like that, and you're out there basically shooting the bad guys and they're kind of coming at you. Your blood raises. This is like becomes almost real type of combat, and the stress level, the emotion level, that's where I think the immersive tech becomes a true game changer for all of our militaries.
What about then the challenges in developing this technology and potentially all the challenges for services in the adoption of it? And is there reticence from some services, from some militaries, in using VR and AR for their training purposes? Eric, over to you.
Yeah, so there is a little bit, right? So it with anything, I think, any cultural change, it's something new that they're actually having to adapt to. So there's a couple things. One is just some of the differences hardware themselves. Some of I would say I work with a lot of different military clients. Some of the decision makers, kind of even trying to put a headset on them, they sort of feel a little bit guarded about that. So that creates a little bit of reticence around that. However, the warfighters themselves, a lot of these kids, 18 to 20-year-old folks, these guys have been operating with this equipment for a long time. So for them, the adoption, the adaptability for them is actually quite easy. So there's a little bit of reticence, but it's actually quickly changing. And when they see the changes in terms of readiness levels and training levels with this, these kinds of tools, all of a sudden the lights start to go on, and then the next thing becomes cost. And they go, wow, I can actually get our forces, from level 1 to level 5 in a much shorter period of time. I'm able to track that with the analytics around that, and I can actually, the retention aspects become, quite a bit better. So.
Yeah, I think a lot of it too is just, this is a new technology. We have organizations we're working with that are reticent to change and adapt new things at times. Well, there's expressed desire. Contractually, it's challenging. Headsets change every 4 months. How do you stay, you can't it's harder when you have contracts that lock you in for long periods of time. This is new stuff. It's changed. Change is challenging. I think there is also, we see a lot of concern around negative training. We learn in VR, we train in AR, we go through and we real life, it's like, oh, something was off in that experience, and now I've learned bad habits, and how I execute. So I think a lot of that is being solved by collaboration, like at the beginning, work together. We love working together with our partners and our clients. So day one, they're embedded part of the process, just to be very, very cognizant of negative training. I think the other thing too, like Eric, you mentioned, there are a lot of leaders that won't get in the headset, at all. And this is an environment and an experience in technology. You have to try it. You can't just look on a screen. You can't look on a slick sheet. You've got to be in the experience for that. And I do think a lot of it is people remember the experience they had with like a cell phone VR experience. They tried it. Oh, I didn't feel good. Well, yeah, that was a really early, low fidelity experience. Now the applications we're building, there's a real care about the frame rate. The headsets are greatly improved. So you're really seeing kind of a change with that. I think also something that, at least we approach it, is encourage them when they're reticent to start, this experience in something new is, okay, let's do a POC. So let's start with a simple, what's one of your problems that you're trying to work through? Let's build a really quick turn. Let's spend just like 3 months. Build something fast, put it on the field. But when you put it out there, structure it as an experiment almost. Structure it right away where I have a control group. Here's how we're training today. Here's our effectiveness. Here's our cost. Let's now try the VR experience. Create a story. So, VR in this case saved us 30%, cut down training time by 30%. We were able to use fewer instructors for this. We were able to send warfighters home with on their couch they could train, and really kind of make it so that when that initial prototype ends, you have that story that you can then kind of go back and say, okay, it worked in this case. Let's try something a little bigger. But I really have liked that approach we've taken with clients.
Yeah, let me just wrap it up to this question. But in an earlier panel this week, one of the senior Navy officials that was part of a panel that talked about this, the last thing he talked about when he's talking about immersive type training and new technology is, I want training that's quicker, better, and cheaper. So this actually wraps up all of those elements that Chris just talked about.
Okay, then let's do some blue sky thinking. Yeah. Let's say in 5 years' time, are we going to have holodecks on the Enterprise? What's the future state of virtual training? Chris, over to you, mate.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And I am personally very excited about it. We're excited as a company. Like I said earlier, headsets every 4 months, we're seeing something new. We have on the floor here at ITSEC, you see a remarkable kind of combination of new hardware that's coming out. So I think we're going to see greater mixed reality. So we have, HoloLens 2s just now being shipped out. So we're very excited about that. We see advances by other traditional AR headsets like a Magic Leap, of what they're working on. I think we also then see companies like Vario, where they have this combination of pass-through video. So that blending of the real world with the virtual world. I think that's a huge part of what we're going to see. Because a lot of what we've been asked to do is like, okay, create me an experience. Let's use real equipment. I don't want to use controllers. We got to move away from controllers as fast as we can. So there's a lot of haptic gloves to kind of get that experience, but I want to integrate the real world as much as I can. And I want to be able to dial that up and down. So I want to have an experience where we're here at ITSEC, where I can be completely transformed, total VR. Then I also want to say, okay, but I want to use this Minesweeper the same time. So today we do that in VR. We build the models and we track it, but I want to more and more make that seamless and easier. And I think that's going to be like one of the key things that we're going to see, that blending and merging of AR and VR into one headset, ideally in the future. Definitely AR, we're still anticipating a lot of things, and that really opens the door that I don't think we even really all understand yet, to be honest, like how to best design for that, how to best interact with it. Where's that most effective? And I think that's just part of this whole learning curve. I do also think on the other side, portability, mobility is huge. So you see headsets now like the Quest from Oculus at amazing price points, low form factor, light, no computer needed. You're not quite the resolution of some of the Vives and Varios, but it's okay for some things. That freedom of being able to move around is really transformative, I think. So really the combo of those two is really what I think we're most excited about.
Yeah, so as a former Navy surface warfare officer, as I was, and I have a family member that's also in the Navy, one of the things that I love to see about some of the tech that Chris is talking about in terms of the future is actually how that actually gets down to the deck plates. The mobility aspect of it, I think, as I mentioned earlier, that is absolutely key. And the way that I think that sailors, airmen, soldiers, Coast Guardmen all train, I think, is going to be, it's so exciting to see things like a HoloLens 2 or things like a Magic Leap, those things actually getting down to the deck plates. And those, the warfighters that are there, they're going to adapt some of that stuff. They're going to help change some of these things. They're going to inform, I think, industry and requirements of how those things are going to actually get adapted. So I think where this is actually going is super interesting. But one of the things that Chris mentioned, I think, is super important to talk about is that scalability, that you can meter it up or meter it down. And with all of the tech that's actually coming out, a company like Booz Allen is going to be able to say, let's take the right pieces of this, let's customize this to the requirements of our clients, and actually, increase their performance over time. So, super excited of where this is going.
Yeah, just to kind of keep thinking about this too is, I've been talking headsets. We're talking headsets. Great advances there, and we're really excited. And that's going to kind of transform the type of things we can do. No question there. But I also think these kind of supporting technologies is really another big key that we'll see a lot more integrated. So AI, of course, we're going to see a lot more AI integration, both in the simulation itself, in the realism, but also in just how we can interact with the world, and having those partners, those AI partner bots and algorithms really kind of help us with things. And I know it seems sci-fi, but we start seeing it now already, kind of working on things. So that's a big part. But also associated outside of AI is kind of the analytics part, the instrumentation. We can capture so much data now with sensors for the training aspect. Really focusing how can we integrate human performance and human performance measures, not just for physical performance, but capturing, cognitive workloads. Are we at a point with this person? It's like, we've been training for a while, like they're not capturing anything new. Let's adjust. Also, adaptive learning. How can we, as we do this training, we realize, okay, they're really struggling with these areas. We're capturing eye gaze. We're capturing the EEGs. We know they're struggling parts. Let's adjust the training just on the fly, just to really focus and not have one training fits all for everybody. I think those also are just going to transform their side to the hardware, but they're kind of these key enabling technologies. They're going to make a big difference.
Well, Chris, Eric, thank you very much for your time. I'm not sure whether to be excited or scared by the idea of future AI partners, but it's certainly a very fast-changing industry, and I think we're all along for the ride. So, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
While the podcast is a newer venture for Shephard Media, We've actually been in the defence publishing business for almost 40 years and have built up a strong and loyal audience base. Our content is trusted and consumed by key decision makers through Shephard Media's multiple channels. One benefit of having such a dedicated audience base is our ability to offer a comprehensive range of message delivery options to our advertisers. From brand awareness campaigns across a combination of print and digital media, through targeted email campaigns or show dailies, to a multitude of online opportunities, or even advertising opportunities within the podcast itself. If you'd like to know more, please visit shepherdmedia.com/advertising.
So I'm on the phone with Richard Whittle. He's the author of The Dream Machine, The Untold History of the Notorious V-22 Osprey. We're speaking to Richard today because I guess the V-22 has reached a bit of a milestone in that it recently topped 500,000 flight hour miles, or the 500,000 flight hour milestone, which I guess is quite a significant achievement given the background of the V-22. But Richard, just I guess to start from the early days, what were some of the historical drivers that resulted in the V-22 program, and what were some of the challenges that the original proponents of the program were trying to overcome?
Yeah, well, thanks, Tony. The idea of the tilt rotor, one of the things that I wrote about in my book, which fascinated me, is the fact that the tilt rotor, this aircraft that has two big rotors on its wingtips that swivel up to fly like a helicopter and forward to fly like an airplane, is a dream actually that went back to the 1930s, almost to the beginnings of rotorcraft, when people kept looking for a way to combine vertical takeoff and landing with horizontal flight, which is a very, very difficult proposition. And in the book, I sort of tell the history of the convertiplane, as it was originally called. And that started out, there was the XV3 convertiplane, which Bell did with, actually the Army was most interested in the tilt rotor among the military services to start with. And then there was the XV15 tilt rotor, which was done with the Army and NASA. And in the 70s, the Marine Corps started looking for a replacement for its CH-46 helicopters, troop-carrying helicopters, which were the primary means in those days of getting Marines ashore from amphibious landing ships. And they had, since the end of World War II, that they needed more speed. And so Navy Secretary John Lehman, who was himself a helicopter pilot, saw the XV-15 tilt rotor fly at the 1981 Paris Air Show and decided the Marines had to have a tilt rotor. And when the Navy Secretary decided that, then the Commandant of the Marine Corps decided that was a great idea, since the Navy Secretary was essentially his boss, and well, also on the merits of the concept too. And amphibious assault has always been the Marine Corps' core mission. And they were worried about losing that mission in a day with long-range anti-ship missiles and nuclear weapons. And so the tilt rotor looked like a way to preserve that mission and to preserve the Marine Corps' independence. So that was a very important aspect of getting the V-22 program started, which I explain in some detail in my book.
And I mean, what about the failure of Operation Eagle Claw, the Desert One incidents?
Yeah, well, you put your finger on one of the most important events in the V-22's history, and one of the most important events in recent American military history. Operation Eagle Claw, of course, was this very complicated plan to rescue 53 Americans who were being held hostage in Iran and had been for 6 months since the Islamic Revolution that overthrew America's ally, the Shah. Excuse me. And the mission template called for an operation that was going to last 2 nights and a day. And the plan was for more than 200 U.S. military personnel, mostly Delta Force commandos, using eight big CH-53 helicopters and roughly the same number of C-130 and C-141 cargo planes, excuse me, to infiltrate Iran and rescue those hostages. And the first night, the helicopters and C-130s were supposed to rendezvous in the desert so the helicopters could refuel from fuel bladders in the C-130s. And then the helicopters were going to carry troops to a couple of hide sites not too far from Tehran, where they were going to lay low all the next day. And then on the second night, the helicopters were going to carry Delta Force troops into Tehran to free the hostages, most of whom were at the U.S. Embassy. And then the helicopters were going to carry everybody from Tehran to an airfield 35 miles south of the city, where C-141s were going to pick them up and fly them out of Iran. So you can see it was quite a complicated bit of choreography here, based on the fact that helicopters were needed to get the hostages out of the city, and helicopters couldn't get there without refueling. So the first night, the mission fell apart when they met at this desert rendezvous that was called Desert One. Two of the helicopters, the CH-53s, had already broken down on their way in, and one of the remaining six broke its landing gear as it taxied across the desert floor. And the commander of the operation, the legendary Colonel Charlie Beckwith, decided to abort the mission. But as the pilot of the helicopter with the broken landing gear tried to lift up and set down close enough to a C-130 to refuel, he got disoriented in all the whirling sand, and his rotor blades hit the C-130 and set off an explosion that killed 5 crew members in the C-130 and 3 Marines in his helicopter. And that pilot, Major Jim Shephard, whose name I mentioned for a reason, was badly burned and barely survived, but he scrambled onto the plane that took everyone out. And I say I mentioned his name for a reason because my book centers sort of tells the story of the V-22 largely through the eyes of the marketer for Bell Helicopter, a guy named Dick Spivey, who had fallen in love with the tilt rotor concept early on and spent his career promoting it and trying to get the military to buy it. And in the course of his work, he had become friends with Jim Shephard. Jim Shephard was stationed at the time at a base in Yuma where the Marines have their primary weapons and tactics school. Is called Marine Air Weapons and Tactics School 1, MAWTS 1. And Spivey would go out there and visit with Jim Shephard and talk about what the Marine Corps needed and talk up the idea of the tilt rotor. And so 2 days after the disaster at Desert One, that Dick Spivey and some of his colleagues at Bell put together a briefing after this disaster at Desert One that showed how it could have been accomplished in a single night if the military had tilt rotors. So that briefing remained very important through the history of the battle over the V-22, and in fact, after 2000, when the V-22 had 2 very bad crashes, and a blue ribbon commission of experts was formed to evaluate the program and see whether the Marines and whether the military actually should continue with the V-22 concept. The final report actually cited the same thing. It said there was no evidence the V-22 concept is fundamentally flawed. And it said, as an example, the Desert One mission involved 2 days of hiding in the desert. So the Desert One disaster, which also, of course, had many effects on the future of the U.S. military, among them an emphasis on joint operations. But that mission was a critical event in the history of the V-22. And the V-22 has, in fact, been used on similar missions, nothing quite so large and dramatic as a hostage rescue in Iran, but lots of missions that the V-22 does, both for the Marines and for the Air Force Special Operations Command, are done at night in one period of darkness.
And, obviously being a joint program, there are certain amounts of design trade-offs if you were designing the aircraft without the shipborne considerations, it would probably look very different.
The V-22 looks the way it does because there were a number of trade-offs that had to be made, ones that upset actually the chief tilt rotor designer at Bell. When John Lehman wanted the Marines to get the tilt rotor, but he knew that the Marines didn't have the budget or the political clout in Congress to keep a huge program, a really expensive aircraft development program going. And the tilt rotor figured to be much more expensive than developing a new helicopter. So he worked to put together a joint program. And what initially the V-22 was supposed to be was a joint program in which the aircraft would be designed to do 10 different missions for 4 different military services. And its main mission was to carry Marines, as many as 24 combat-loaded troops. But it was also supposed to do all the other transport missions of a CH-46 helicopter that the Marines flew, or the Sikorsky CH-53D helicopter the Marine Corps flew. And for the Air Force, the V-22 was going to be used for special operations missions, which it is today. And for the Air Force and Navy both, the V-22 was supposed to be a combat search and rescue aircraft. And then the Army also wanted the V-22 to do this pretty exotic electronic intelligence mission. And the requirements for that mission, Tony, said the aircraft had to be able to cruise at 30,000 feet, which is well above where you need oxygen, but evade surface-to-air missiles by diving toward the Earth at a descent rate of 20,000 feet per minute or more, while doing a split-S maneuver and dispensing chaff and flares, and then fly nap of the Earth. And it was supposed to have external hard points for extra fuel tanks and electronic countermeasures. I think you get the picture. The V-22, the original design was supposed to be this really quite complicated aircraft. But even for the Marine Corps, one of the problems was that they wanted an aircraft that would carry as many troops as the CH-46, and they wanted it to fit on a Tarawa-class amphibious assault ship, an LHA, because amphibious assault has always been the Marine Corps' primary mission. And and just one more thought. I mean, just thinking about this, when Ken Wernicke, who I featured in my book as well, was also a real true believer in the tilt rotor and how it was going to revolutionize rotorcraft, because the biggest problem with rotorcraft, one of the biggest problems with them over the years, has been the fact that the aerodynamics of rotor blades limit the top speed that a helicopter can reach. And so the tilt rotor was a way around that problem, and there have been dozens of attempts to design aircraft that could solve that problem. And so Ken Wernicke really believed that the tilt rotor was going to be the dream machine that was going to solve that problem and create an aircraft that could take off and land vertically and fly fast. And when he looked at the requirements that the military had placed on the V-22, he actually threatened to resign. He went to his boss and he said, "I'm not going to try to design this. It's going to be a disaster. It's going to discredit the tilt rotor forever." And his boss talked him into staying and designing the Osprey anyway. But, as it turned out, Wernicke was nearly right about the effect the Osprey was going to have on the tilt rotor's reputation, because even today, I think, with 500,000 operational hours and many good things the Osprey has done, it still hasn't really recovered from this sort of horrible reputation that it developed in its first, what I call the ugly duckling years. So.
Well, I mean, this is a good chance maybe to go into that period. I mean, we don't need to go into sort of a blow by blow. I guess it was three major incidents with fatalities. But in general, how would you sort of describe that period? I mean, how close was the program to being terminated?
Well, in the book, I call it the Dark Ages. The crash at Marana, Arizona, in April of 2000. And then a second crash which killed 19 Marines. And then a second crash in New River, North Carolina in December of 2000 resulted in the V-22 being grounded. Especially, there were lots of people who wanted to cancel it. 60 Minutes then got hold of allegations from a maintainer in the V-22 squadron, the one squadron that the Marine Corps had at the time, that they were falsifying maintenance data. And so the V-22 became a huge scandal in the year 2000. And there was every reason to believe that it would be canceled. Anyway, a Blue Ribbon Commission was formed of experts to examine the V-22, and their work took a long time. And in the meantime, the Marines who were at the training squadron were basically told that they weren't allowed to fly. They were barely allowed to touch the aircraft. And a lot of the pilots, at least, and others, I guess, transferred out of that squadron to go elsewhere. And for the ones that were left, it was a really dismal time. And then the crash in Marana, Arizona, it was concluded had been caused by something called vortex ring state, which is essentially, it means a rotor descends too rapidly and stops producing lift. And so the V-22 had never been tested for vortex ring state because nobody thought about vortex ring state much. Pilots were taught to avoid it by not descending too quickly. And so the V-22 had to be tested again, and that took several years. And then in 2005, when all that testing was done and they were ready to start the steps necessary to put the V-22 in service, I knew that they felt they were out of trouble when they invited me and a bunch of other reporters to come down to North Carolina and ride on the V-22. So I figured if they thought there was any risk, they wouldn't be inviting us.
And from a personal point of view, looking back over the duration of the program, did you ever think that we'd be at the stage where they've reached that 500,000 mile flight hour milestone?
Well, not for a long time. I mean, I started covering the V-22 when I was a reporter for the Dallas Morning News in the Washington Bureau. And so I covered the program off and on, not as a beat, but off and on for much of the period of its development. And I never imagined, but it did seem like it was a program that was perhaps doomed to failure until I flew in it. The pilot was a young lieutenant colonel at the time named Chris Seymour, call sign Mongo. And we get in the aircraft and strap in, and it started to take off, and it felt a little bit like a helicopter. And then suddenly, he tilts the nose of the aircraft up, and as I wrote at the time, it felt like you were in a Corvette sports car that had been floored. Yeah, I mean, this thing just the big prop rotors when they're tilted forward, they have an immense amount of power. And one of the things that I liked about it was during the ride, where he put us through like a T2G turn to sort of throw your back up against the wall, and then he hovered over a grassy area and put the aircraft down and took off again and did a sort of a pirouette and then came back and landed. And one of the things you notice about it immediately, if you've ever ridden in military helicopters, is how you don't have the vibration. The noise is pretty much the same because these aircraft are not insulated against noise. But you don't have the vibration you have in a helicopter where you have the rotor overhead. As you probably know, I'm sure you know, Tony, the old joke is that a helicopter is just a a collection of thousands of parts flying in close formation, and so the vibration is usually pretty significant in a military helicopter, and there wasn't none of that in the V-22. It was a very smooth ride, very fast ride, and so I think the V-22 was a smooth ride in comparison in airplane mode, and that's one of the things that the opponents of the V-22 I think never quite gave it credit for, is that it's not really a helicopter that can fly fast. It's an airplane that can land and take off vertically. And so, yeah, and you get the benefits of the V-22 from the fact that it is an airplane more than you get the benefit of vertical takeoff and landing. And of course, the V-22 itself can't hover as efficiently as a helicopter can, and it's big. But that's why you mentioned earlier that Bell has designed under something called the Joint Multi-Role Technology Demonstration Program a new tilt rotor, a smaller tilt rotor. I think it's designed to carry maybe 11 troops, called the V-280, and the 280 stands for the fact that it's meant to fly 280 knots speed, which is, I think, in the neighborhood of twice as fast as the best military helicopters go. And they have tried to learn from the I want to call them design difficulties, if not design flaws, of the V-22. So the V-22 is the first operational tilt rotor, and I expect there will be more.
This episode of the Weekly Defence Podcast was brought to you in partnership with our sponsor, Nammo. As always, a big thanks to everyone who gave their time to be part of this week's episode. And for our listeners, make sure you like and subscribe, leave a review on iTunes, and tell a friend or colleague about the podcast. Until next week, thanks for listening.